Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome. I'm Ashish Kapoor Siddiq, a faculty member here at the UMass History Department and a member of the organizing committee for this year's Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's panel. Uh, Offered every other year by the UMass History Department, this year's Feinberg series is focusing on the theme, What Are Universities For? Struggles for the Soul of Higher Education. The various events explore the roots of the political, economic, and ethical crises in higher education. On behalf of the History Department here at UMass, the College of the Humanities and Fine Arts at UMass, and the University of Massachusetts, I extend our gratitude to the esteemed attorney and UMass history alumnus Kenneth Feinberg, whose generosity makes the series possible. I also thank the faculty and staff in the History Department who organized this year's series and the 36 academic partners who sponsored it. Before we go any further, a few technical notes. Live closed captioning is available over Zoom. Please consult the chat for instructions on how to enable it. If you are a student attending as part of a course, please sign in via the link, which we will post in the chat. Due to the number of people in attendance, participation in the chat has been restricted. We do encourage you to submit questions to the speakers via the Q&A tool at any time during this event. The moderator will be collecting questions and introducing as many as possible to the conversation. So please do send those questions in through the Q&A tool. I invite everyone to visit the Feinberg Series website at umass.edu/Feinberg for recordings of this fall's event and to register for the forthcoming events, which include later this spring, which include a student-curated exhibit called Be Revolutionary on UMass student efforts to end CIA recruitment on campus in the 1980s, as well as the annual James Baldwin Lecture this year to be delivered by Stephen Salaita. Finally, on behalf of the Feinberg Committee, I acknowledge that UMass Amherst is located on the unceded homelands of the Patumcut Nation on the land of the Norwottuck community. Inspired by this year's focus on the role of higher education in society, we encourage you to join us in considering how our university's contributions to Indigenous land dispossession, as well as the carbon pollution, war, and other forms of violence that continue to kill, impoverish, and make refugees of Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities around the world. We also recognize the university's enormous capacity to help solve these problems. The series is an invitation to us all to reflect on these questions to get involved in collective movements for justice and repair. Today, we are very proud to host a conversation on the rise and fall of student debt, a panel conversation on student debt, the crisis of global capitalism, and global movements fighting to end debt and transform higher education. We are joined today by Leigh-Ann Naidoo, Astra Taylor, and Kelly Gillespie. Leigh-Ann Naidoo is an educationalist who is on the faculty at the University of Cape Town at the School of Education. A former Olympic athlete, Naidoo was involved in hashtag Roads Must Fall and hashtag Fees Must Fall struggles and formed part of the 2016 all-women international flotilla mission to attempt to break the Israeli blockade of Gaza. She is interested in knowledge production outside of the confines of the academic project and is working collectively to develop daily pedagogies that confront the violences that are the reality of the majority of people on the planet, to work towards some form of resistance and repair. She continues to be involved in reimagining the university as an institution with the potential to radically change society. Astra Taylor is a writer, documentarian, and co-founder of The Debt Collective, a union of debtors. She is the author of numerous books, including The Age of Insecurity, Coming Together as Things Fall Apart, Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone, The People's Platform, which won an American Book Award, and most recently, Solidarity, The Past, Present, and Future of a World-Changing Idea, which she co-authored with Leah Hunt Hendricks. She is the director of What is Democracy, Zizek, Examined Life, You Are Not Alone, and other films. Her writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, N+1, The Baffler, and other places. Tonight's moderator, Kelly Gillespie, is a political and legal anthropologist at the University of Cape Town, where she writes and teaches about law and justice, urbanism, sexualities, race, and the praxis of social justice. She has been involved in work on the decolonization of the university in South Africa, supporting student movement activism and disciplinary and curriculum reconstruction. With Naidoo, Gillespie is co-author of several articles in critical university studies, including Abolition Pedagogy, Force Fields of Critique, and Between the Cold War and the Fire, the Student Movement, Anti-Assimilation, and the Question of the Future in South Africa. Gillespie also works beyond the university in popular education projects supporting a broad range of social justice formations. Welcome, Kelly Gillespie.
Thanks so much, Ashish. It's good to be with you. Thank you and welcome everyone. I imagine many of you have been feeling anxious, even fearful about what is going on at universities at the moment. Conversations about the struggle for the soul of higher education are desperately needed. And so it's good to be here with you, being in ongoing conversation with each other. Collectivizing is critical in this moment. So a special welcome as we gather to think together in this current political climate. The current assaults on universities in the US, but in many other places, India under Modi's government, Turkey under Erdogan's, Argentina under Milei's, are a particularly vicious ideological attack on democratic politics. But they represent a crisis in higher education that has been in the making really since the 1970s, when the argument was mounted for the disinvestment in public education after a major period of its expansion and after the inclusion of new kinds of students who were never imagined to be the recipients of university education. This phase of austerity capitalism from the 1970s is often referred to, of course, as neoliberalism, but it is also well described as financialization. When finance was loosened from industrial processes and there was a general growth in the financial sector and its instruments. This phase has involved the emergence of increasingly speculative financial techniques, including, and this is really important for our conversation today, the explosion of debt as a mechanism of accumulation and dispossession. So at the same time as budgets to public education were being slashed, new techniques of debt creation were expanding to produce student debt. This has been true for education, but also for public health, public housing, in fact, all public services. As Hannah Appel reminds us, whether student, medical, foreclosure, municipal, or sovereign, these forms of debt are all connected to each other and to the project of growing inequality both intranationally and internationally. In 1987, Thomas Sankara, then president of Burkina Faso, stood up at a meeting of the Organization of African Unity to argue that a pernicious new form of neo-colonialism had begun to structure a global relationship to Africa, the rise of the project of indebtedness. Quoting Sankara from that speech, under its current form, controlled and dominated by imperialism, debt is a skillfully managed reconquest of Africa, intended to subjugate its growth and development through foreign rules. We are asked, Sankara said, to be accomplices in a balancing favoring those with financial power, end quote. The foreign rules Sankara was describing were the stipulations of the structural adjustment programs imposed on African countries by the IMF and the World Bank as part of its loan and debt arrangements, a key feature of emerging post-Cold War capitalism. One of the most significant casualties of the structural adjustment programs of the 70s and 80s on the continent were its universities. Sankara was correct to understand that debt came into play as a mode of coercion just as anti-colonial movements were beginning to deepen their expression in newly independent projects of knowledge. CODESRIA, the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, a hugely ambitious Pan-African intellectual project, was founded in 1973 in West Africa. The influential Dar es Salaam debates in the 70s and early 80s in East Africa, to name two striking cases, were indicative of a reassertion of African intellectual and political life after independence, an assertion and a confidence that were reliant on substantial and consistent investment in public universities. As Federici, Kafensis, and Naidoo write in their introduction to an edited volume on struggles against structural adjustment in African universities, quote, by the mid-1980s, as country after country adopted the structural adjustment programs imposed by the World Bank and the IMF, presumably to stimulate economic recovery, the African education system entered an historic crisis. All funds to the public education were cut. Many teachers and other academic staff were retrenched and wages frozen. Increasingly, the main role of the African state was to provide the repressive force necessary for the application of structural adjustment programs. Many African academics who, after working in African universities, decided to leave, either because they could no longer support themselves by teaching there, or because of the escalating government repression, or both. End quote. What Sankara rightly diagnosed is that there is something punitive about the imposition of debt, something that uses debt as a foil for resentment at the assertion of an autonomous post-colonial African project, seeking to rebuild the continent after decades of underdevelopment. Something in the structure of debt that produces a nefarious, debilitating culpability that enables a culture of control and hierarchy by strange and often unnameable means. Debt creates an unnerving complicity in its terms. Debt hides its unequal politics in a discourse of balance and responsibility, and debt resists collectivization against it. When Sankara tried to define the problem in 1987, he sought to rally African governments to deliberately and collectively default on debt payments as a way to disrupt the mechanism of control European powers were developing in the wake of colonialism. He said that if his country, Burkina Faso, were alone in refusing to pay back debts to Europe, he surely wouldn't make it to the next meeting of the OAU. A few months after his address, Sankara was assassinated in a coup. And one of the first acts of the new government, while his body was barely cold, was to reinstate the relationship with the IMF, secure a large loan, and agree to structural adjustment program measures. Such punishment for the aspiration of autonomy is hardly new. Even as debt galloped in with neoliberalism and financialization, the aspirations of the Haitian Revolution were famously met with debt as punishment. In this longer view, debt takes on the quality of post-democratization backlash or rollback, a repositioning of forces for continued underdevelopment and extractivism. And it is certainly the case that just as Black people, queers, women started to get access to higher education, as hard struggles for access helped to create African, ethnic, women's, queer, indigenous, disability studies departments, life at universities became increasingly filled with toxic, time-wasting administration, corporate hierarchy, police, state repression and criminalization, as is clarified in the US currently, austerity, and massive, massive amounts of bad debt. Thomas Sankara's premonition about his assassination is instructive. He knew that if others didn't join him in his critique of the politics of debt, if others didn't default with him, he wasn't going to last long. In these times of criminalization and budget slashing, every force against us is trying to individualize the problem and make each of us responsible for it. The only shot we have is to be skilled at figuring out what constitutes a political language for our current predicament and to collectivize around it. Debt has become a near universal condition under the current phase of capitalism. Unless we understand this, how far and how deeply it reaches, we will be subject to its isolating function. We will be debilitated unless we build connections and solidarities not only with other debtors, but with other debtors across national contexts. There are many struggles from which we can learn, both contemporary and historic, and we'll hear about some of them from our speakers today. But I particularly want to raise up the young organizers that fought valiantly on the streets of Kenya last year against tax hikes emanating from a 2021 IMF bailout package, a package which squeezed the Kenyan government to pay off past debts in a context in which debt at all levels has become endemic. So thank you to the organizers of the Feinberg series for their willingness to invite speakers from different national contexts, South Africa and the US, and a moderator who begins thinking about debt from the structural adjustment programs imposed on Africa in the 1980s, for this welcome opportunity to share resources from ongoing struggles against illegitimate debt across the world. So I'll end there by inviting Leigh-Ann Naidoo to speak on South African student struggles, and Leigh-Ann will then pass on to Astra Taylor after that. Leigh-Ann, welcome.
Thank you, Kelly. So I want to start by thanking colleagues from the UMass Amherst Department of History and their partners whose work makes this important series possible. I'm grateful to be part of this year's theme, asking us all to consider what are universities for? So let me say something brief about universities. The university is a dangerous institution. Dangerous in a number of ways. I will raise 4 of them to begin. First, universities both in South Africa and the US, in fact in most settler colonies, are complicit and central to the founding and development of the colonial state. This is particularly so in those parts of the British Empire where, according to Caitlin Harvey, and I quote, over 15 million acres of indigenous lands across 3 continents were transferred to settler universities, end quote. This stolen land was used to either build or finance the building of universities, which were called land-grant universities, or, as indigenous people have more appropriately called them, land-grab universities. Maya Wynne describes in her recent book, Towers of Ivory and Steel, how Israeli universities were complicit in the building of the State of Israel. She calls them settler universities and shows how they were built to settle Palestinian land at key moments and on strategic sites. Nomalanga Mkhize and Pedro Mussolini have argued that South African universities were deliberately, quote, set into the land as immovable and concrete physical infrastructures, which almost made the possibility of transforming them post-apartheid more difficult. Second, universities are dangerous because they are what I call factories of assimilation, in the main inducting young people through education qualifications into middle-class life, which often lures one into a comfort with the status quo and the relative privileges afforded to university graduates. Third, universities are dangerous because they are liberal institutions that try and present themselves as neutral or apolitical or above and outside the world or societies in which they operate, either choosing to not get involved in contentious issues or suggesting that there's some kind of equal space for reasoned debate with all sides of a conflict. Fourth, universities and education more generally are dangerous in another important way. As has been shown in South Africa, the state could not control education completely. One of the most important contradictions and ironies of the apartheid education system was that it produced inferior levels of education and mental stimulation for Black learners, relegating them through a deliberately limited curriculum to second-class citizenship, while at the same time created conditions for mounting anti-apartheid energies in school boycotts, mass organizing in schools and universities, and the rise of a youth movement that dramatically escalated the anti-apartheid struggle. Universities have been systematically deployed for the consolidation of colonial and class inequality, even as they have also offered the possibility of space and time for its critique. So there have been moments in history when the university, and specifically its students, have taken the lead in raising pertinent questions of the time. Most famously, this happened in the 1968-69 moment of global student resistance, when students pushed the civil rights and anti-war politics into a global movement of cultural resistance. A decade ago, in 2015, we saw another key moment in world history where university students pushed and took the lead in the politics of the university and society, from India to Turkey to Chile, Brazil, Mexico, Canada, Germany, Italy, Ethiopia, and the US, amongst others. Students then were challenging not only the state of corporatization of the university, most keenly felt by them through structures of fees and debt, but also the unequal global financial system that produces it. The Fees Must Fall student movement that I will speak about today was the South African iteration of this global movement, which focused on an anti-privatization agenda, questioning the way in which universities were being corporatized through increasing tuition fees. Also raising the important question of education as a public good that should be free for all and not a commodity to be bought. Students continue to open the possibility for a more critical reflection on and a role for universities and the people who occupy them. At the end of formal apartheid, one of the more successful programs of the ANC government was to democratize access to higher education. During the first 2 decades after 1994, student enrollment at universities more than doubled in a process referred to as the massification of higher education. During the same period, the proportion of Black students at universities increased to 81% of the student population. At historically white and therefore well-resourced universities, the relaxation of laws preventing access to Black students meant that the kinds of students entering the universities were not at all the kind of students for whom they had been built and imagined. The post-apartheid state, overseeing this task of democratization in an age of neoliberalization, oversaw Black inclusion in higher education, but they didn't finance it. So the exit from formal apartheid was not so much that the state withdrew existing funding, but that as it expanded its commitment to racial equality and access, it didn't finance its democratic policies. So the result for universities was the absorption of a huge increase in student population, which created a squeeze of resources. The effect of this squeeze was the massification of classrooms, with faculty having to confront first-year classes of 500 students or more, which strained the possibilities of pedagogies for democracy, and year-on-year rising student tuition really encumbered Black families. Importantly, for what I want to say today, the squeezing of university budgets also involved university managements outsourcing and casualizing service work on campuses across the country. This meant that the poorest Black workers on campus, cleaning and gardening and maintenance workers, lost permanent employment at universities, and for the same amount and place of labor, they had their salaries slashed and lost all their benefits. In late 2015, the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg announced a 10.5% hike in student fees. This increase came on the heels of year-on-year above-inflation increases, signaling the incremental privatization of higher education. This dynamic was felt most acutely by the thousands of Black students, mostly the first in their families to attend university. The protest against this fee increase grew and grew until they became the largest national protest since the end of apartheid, involving all of the country's universities, many schools and communities, the storming of government buildings, and so on, or the Fees Must Fall movement. So one of the most compelling dynamics of the South African student movement was the building of alliances across the country between students and outsourced campus workers. Since the process of outsourcing of service workers had begun on campuses in the early 2000s, small groups of left student activists and staff had mobilized against this outsourcing, or for what in South Africa became known as insourcing, or reversing of the outsourcing process. Because of the slow and unpopular organizing over 15 years, when the swell of the student movement came, it was possible to make the argument that rising student fees and outsourcing were linked processes. Both were responses to budget constraints. Both were modes of privatization that had an anti-Black effect in the institution. This brought Black students and workers into a deep alliance with each other in the strike action. with workers downing tools for student demands, protecting student activists, and raising bail money for arrested students. And on the other hand, students massifying the demand for decent work for the black workers who had all but been invisibilized on campuses by the outsourcing process. In fact, in the midst of the growing demise of unions more generally in South Africa, the workers understood their alliance with students as being much more powerful than union representation. An extraordinary form of solidarity took shape at the center of the student movement between black students and black workers. An exquisite vocabulary of kinship was put to use in an explicitly political register. Students began referring to workers as our mothers and fathers, and workers speaking of students as our children. The claiming of familial intimacy as a register for political solidarity against privatization was a striking strategy, and one which came to have real political force. When the Fees Must Fall strike was successful in getting government to concede to a 0% increase in student fees the following year, what was a fraction of the demand for free education, but it did relieve immediate duress for students, the majority of students left the strike and went back to class. However, a cadre of students were outraged that their peers would go back to class when nothing, in fact, had been won for the workers who had been so crucial to the student strike action. They, with workers, kept campuses shut down while facing off mounting police aggression and a really hostile university management. It was in this difficult moment of the strike, with a small group holding a strong political demand, that we were able to force the hand of the university management to concede to a number of demands around student debt, but also to the setting up of a task team that could look at the insourcing of campus workers. So I want to describe some of what happened in and around that insourcing task team, because I think this is important for our deliberations here. So when the university management sat down with us at the negotiating table, their position was, if we give in to insourcing, the academic project is destroyed. So they put forward that they simply couldn't afford, within the existing budget constraints, to employ workers directly, and that the university's debt would increase to unsustainable levels, threatening the viability of the institution as a whole. It was at institutional level an argument about scarcity and the importance of austerity in conceptualizing the problem of resources. So there were two major moves that we made in response. I hope that these may be extrapolated out to think about the kinds of moves we can make as part of a wider project on facing the cluster of problems: debt, austerity, crisis, securitization, criminalization, that are facing universities everywhere. So let me say up front that one of the most important victories of the South African student movement was, in fact, the rolling back of outsourcing on campuses across the country. So I describe these arguments to you because they were, in the end, effective in producing a quite remarkable victory, given how much of the South African political economy was pushing in the other direction. So when we sat down and confronted university management, we realized that we would never win if negotiations were caught within the frame of the budget. We began to realize that much of our political work at that negotiation table was to break the frame of the argument, was to actively create a different frame for being able to discuss the demand for insourcing. Firstly, they began with a classic economistic argument about how they understood the budget and we didn't, and we therefore had to trust their reading of the budgets. It took a long time to get them to actually give us the budget for scrutiny. When we finally did, we had a difficult moment because we felt obliged to agree that the money was really tight and it was going to be difficult to pull off insourcing given the constraints of the university budget. Then we began to realize that the whole equation that framed the negotiation was something that we would have to rethink as part of our political strategy. We couldn't win the negotiation if we stayed within the argument or frame of the budget. What we began to advance was a strong political argument that our starting point for the conversation was not the university budget, but the lives of Black workers. We refused their financial argument and pressurized them to account for Black life at the university. This may seem like a simple or obvious move, but it wasn't. It wasn't easy to find and it wasn't easy to make. One of the functions of outsourcing was to allow the university to pretend that it wasn't responsible for workers because a private company was contracted to manage those workers, and the university was only accountable to the contract, not the workers, even though the same workers did the same labor on the same property of the university for the same amount of time that they had done before outsourcing had taken place. So the function of outsourcing was to cut the possibility of considering workers as part of the campus community. It was to force them into a different category of person, beyond collegiality, beyond belonging. They are not ours, they are not of us. What Black students invented when they began calling workers our mothers and fathers was to deliberately create kinship and belonging across outsourcing. They rebuilt a fabric of relationality when the logics of privatization insisted that there was no relation. The language of kinship was a brilliant insistence on a durable relationality under conditions of severance and isolation. They moved towards the redistribution of worth, making kin and value where privatization had degraded the possibility of relationship. And in so doing, they provided ground for us to be able to resist assimilation into the anti-Black economistic terms of management. We began to say things in the negotiation like, if this was your mother, how would you be able to sleep at night? You'd never make an argument that slavery should be sustained because it's more financially sustainable for the economic system as it stands. We kind of shamed them by asking over and over about the ethical, moral, and political limits of arguing about fiscus. And we broke their frame at least for as long as it took to get a commitment out of them. So the second move that was made in the insourcing task team is related, but pertains more directly to debt. So when university managements in South Africa began outsourcing in the early 2000s, workers' salaries were halved overnight. They lost medical insurance, the right to send their children to the university without cost. They lost bargaining power against the university, and their access to amenities on campus was seriously curtailed. We argued that the cost-saving mechanism of outsourcing was in fact a way of displacing risk and debt directly onto Black workers. Financial precarity of the institution was managed by hiding the problem of risk in the private lives of the most vulnerable members of the university community. In South Africa, the word for Black working class loan sharks is mashonisa. Ukushonisa is derived from the words to sink, to impoverish, to become poor and die. While mashonisa have long been a feature of Black urban life in South Africa, they've exponentially increased in post-apartheid, even though they remain informal and illegal. For poor Black people in South Africa, Ukushonisa has created unbridled growth in unsecured lending. With interest rates often between 25 and 50%, the extortionist lending practices Mashonisa can create puts a great deal of pressure on the salaries and livelihoods of already precarious poor Black workers and their families. Many commentators have linked the Marikana massacre that many of you would have heard of at Londelman Mines in South Africa to the fact that many of the striking workers were up to their eyes in debt from Mashonisas circulating in that mining belt. One writer shows images of 11 shopfront lending businesses on a short, dusty road of Marikana. Police killed 34 miners in that campaign, seriously wounding another 78. Outsourced workers at universities are exposed to similar financial conditions and confirm that they were using Mashonisas as a strategy of getting by every month. Indebtedness was not only passed on to the university's most vulnerable workers, it was passed on at a much higher interest rate and with much greater threat of violence and the destruction of lives. The risk, in fact, increases, but at the same moment as it is obscured and relegated to Black life. So the process of hiding was so thorough that Black workers could no longer even be seen to be of the same time and place as the rest of the university community. So when the university said this is not financially viable, the university will collapse, we added, it already collapses, but at the sight of workers' lives and families that you are trying to obscure. The politics of obscural, of devolution, of hiding the human and particularly racial and gendered cost of economies has of course always been a feature of capitalism, but the extremity of its current methods where workers are disappeared as stakeholders in their places of work affects our capacity to recognize these processes. Again, when we first heard comrades making this argument, it became obvious that displacement, the passing on of debt to the most vulnerable, as well as the escalation of risk, was what was at stake. but it was difficult to understand and name that process at first. When we sat with workers and we built that alliance, we could look at the problem of debt from the vantage point of workers' lives. It became clear that while the university's debt was at least temporarily minimized by outsourcing, the workers' debt were exponentially exploded. So the same logic is at work in student fee hikes. The limitation of public spending on higher education passes on its cost to private budgets, and where that stress is felt the most is in the first generation of Black university students. The state's argument against free higher education was that once students had graduated, their chances of getting a job and earning a middle-class salary increased dramatically. Student debt made sense to them because they were occluding from the equation the translation of education into wages into debt repayment. The degree to which one Black university graduate's salary must pay for the lives of many others. You must pay for your siblings' education, your parents' retirement, you must give to your high school, all the while trying to represent oneself to white colleagues at work as equal and having authority. In South Africa, we call this black tax, the obligation to redistribute the cost of being the one who made it through to a degree and a good job. In a recent book collecting biographic reflections on black tax, one commentator put it starkly, quote, "There's no black middle class, only poverty masked by graduation gowns and debts," end quote. If we did not relentlessly make the set of racialized social obligations visible, discussable, they would have been hidden, that is, invisibilized, and erased from all calculations and equations. What the protest against fees and outsourcing did was to erupt the hidden curriculum of debt and risk that had permeated the education project. It surfaced the obscured violence of race and the histories of worth and worthlessness that it entails and reproduces. Our job was to make this surfacing increasingly clear, to feed what the objections revealed into an institutional process, even as we were suspicious of it, to win whatever victories we could in the moment of the strike, getting hold of the frame, breaking it, turning the narrative on itself, forcing new information on the table. These were what made the negotiations successful, but they took hard work to articulate. So from this process, we learned to ask this question: what are the conditions under which the breaking of the frame of the budget is possible? How do we create and recreate those conditions, opening the possibility of landing a radically different way of thinking about worth and resources so that we can force viable livelihoods in the conceptualization of economies? We have to fight institution by institution, but those fights have to reach out across campuses, and they have to also reach beyond campuses to build broad fronts, make allies, so that we can work together on projects that change the ground of the conversation, that actually contest power. Thank you. And now I'll hand over to Astra for her input.
My God, that was amazing. Thank you. Thanks to our kind host for convening this important discussion. Such a great honor to speak after Leigh-Ann and Kelly, because there's so much resonance across the focuses of our presentations. I'm going to share my screen, and let's see, here we go. Okay. Assuming that works. Okay, so I am not an academic. I think it's important to say for the context of this conversation, but I am academic adjacent. I'm a big nerd, and I often deeply rely on scholarship. I am a writer, filmmaker, and a little unexpected to me, even though I've been doing this for now 12 years, an organizer. I am a co-founder of the Debt Collective, which is an experimental union of debtors that was born amidst Occupy Wall Street. So a lot of context has been set, but actually, if I speak personally, the seeds of this project for me were actually born during the global justice movement, when as a 19, 20-year-old, I attended teach-ins on the sovereign debt crisis and on the Jubilee 2000 movement. So movement for debt cancellation for countries that were being robbed by the IMF, the World Bank. And those were my first introductions into debt as a political tool. And it took until Occupy, so over 10 years, for me to become involved in conversations, said, wow, how could are there lessons from that movement and those understandings of debt as an anti-democratic tool of extraction and racial domination that we can apply to actually our daily lives in the United States. And that conversation became much more possible during Occupy after the financial crisis. So this is a drawing by the artist Molly Crabapple that was from 2011. And the slogan of the Occupy movement was "Banks got bailed out, we got sold out." And we were looking at the way that we would often say, we're occupying Wall Street, but Wall Street's actually occupying our lives. And it does that through debt. We are underpaid at the job. We are denied the basic services we need to live. And so we have to borrow to make ends meet. So effectively, the 99% are robbed twice. We're robbed at the job, and then we are robbed by predatory lenders. So one of the many slogans of the Debt Collective is, we are not living beyond our means. We are denied the means to live, right? We are forced into debt. Household debt in the US is now $17 trillion, and it's going to rise. This is going to be one of the most sort of immediate consequences of the current Trump administration. When you have mass layoffs, when you have the decimation of the already withered welfare state, when you have the deregulation of corporations and the financial sector, when you have the destruction of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, well, what's that going to mean for people's daily lives? When you have inflation and prices rising, it's going to mean more debt. It's going to mean more borrowing. So this is, the Debt Collective is not just about debt for its own sake. It's again about understanding debt as a power relation and objecting to the fact that we increasingly have to debt finance, which should be democratic public goods. Debt, as I said, we're robbed twice. Debt is a form of wealth transfer from the working class to the wealthy, to the investors. So we have to understand that our debts are someone else's assets. They're on the balance sheets. Under neoliberalism, the corporation and the state often merge. So sometimes we owe our debts, like our student loans, to the federal government. And sometimes we owe our debts to the banks or credit card lenders or predatory lenders. But the point is, in all those cases, it's extractive, and there's a real double standard in the way debt is wielded. Wealthy people do have debt, but often use it to leverage more wealth and more power. So that's why somebody like Donald Trump can boast that he's the king of debt. He's very savvy. So for rich people, it's a strategic default, right? Whereas poor people go bankrupt. Debt has long been a tool of profit, of racial domination, of social control. So lots of examples already given by the previous speakers. In the United States, for example, debt was a major tool of dispossession of indigenous people. So we have figures like founding father Thomas Jefferson saying we should be very happy to see indigenous communities go into debt, because then we will be able to take their lands. If you look at the founding of Canada and the Hudson Bay Company, there was often a conscious effort to drive for indigenous fur traders into debt to power colonial expansion. So, and we see this, throughout history, where debt is extremely racialized, with after emancipation and the Civil War, sharecropping, which is essentially, indebting farmers to maintain racial and economic hierarchies. Or we know about the history of redlining in this country. So these, debt is never neutral. It's always, there are always serious power dynamics. And we see that in the distribution of debt across the board. It is a racialized, it is a racialized phenomenon. And so just looking at student debtors alone, which is, I think, a decent focus for us, people who are most burdened by student debt are, perhaps unsurprisingly, Black women. And this is precisely because of the Black tax Leigh-Ann spoke about. I mean, people are told, okay, you need to go to school, you need to take on debt to get ahead. But for a lot of people, it's not to get ahead. It's just to have an equal foot in the door, right? If you're, if you're a Black woman, maybe you need a bachelor's degree to compete with a white high school graduate. But and then of course, if you need that degree, you're going to have you have less intergenerational wealth to draw on. You have probably, you might have more family obligations. You are also going to experience wage discrimination after graduation. It's going to make it harder to pay off your debt. So these bigger socio-political dynamics are always in play, and what they create is a very unequal and very predictable distribution of debt. So student debtors, are not, as the right tells us over and over, and many Democrats as well, they like to portray student debtors as elites, as part of this college-educated class. The fact is 40% of student debtors don't even have a college degree. So, and so those arguments are part of what's always, at the fore of fighting against student debt cancellation, student debt abolition. And in the recent years, sort of what was the quiet part is now being said increasingly out loud. So in some of the fights against Biden's student debt relief plan, right-wing litigants literally said, we don't like student debt relief because it advances racial justice. We don't like student debt relief because it will give people more freedom to change jobs. So things that we were inferring for many years are now explicit. So as I said, Occupy Wall Street was the seat of the debt collective. 2011, 2012, we were saying we want full student debt cancellation. We want free public college for all. And these are just some quotes from the media saying, the media's response at the time was like, that's laughable. Most experts believe there's little chance the government will ever forgive student loans. That was what NPR said. Well, we proved them wrong. What we did was we got organized, and I think it's really important. Our point was that debtors together have power, but right now we're so ashamed, we're so isolated that we're suffering alone. So how did we get organized? Well, we tried to figure out what forms of power do debtors have when they work together. So we did base building, we engaged in narrative change, right? We said, no, actually, college debt is immoral, right? It's not that we are bad people. We created novel systems of mutual aid. We engaged in economic disobedience or debt strikes, and we did radical policy research to understand the laws and rules that we could pressure elected officials to use. So the first thing we did was we launched something called the Rolling Jubilee, which has carried through until we're still doing it, but we figured out novel ways of buying and erasing various forms of debt. So we, in 2023, we raised $10 million for people who went to Morehouse College, which is a historically Black college, which allowed thousands of students to access their transcripts and their degrees. We also did this for Bennett College, which is a historical Black college that focuses on Black women. We just erased a bunch of abortion debt to make the connection between medical debt and abortion services. We erased millions of dollars for people who are incarcerated, who owed probation debt. And that was part of that is to say, look, if a bunch of activists can do this, then why can't the government? And also to just build solidarity across different kinds of debt. We really, and I mentioned the idea of economic disobedience. We also got this issue on the agenda by launching a debt strike. This was launched in 2015. Began with the Corinthian 15. So 15 students had gone to a predatory college called Corinthian Colleges that was collapsing. And people they were not paying. They were in default. They were suffering the worst consequences of being unable to pay for predatory degrees from a for-profit college. And they had signed away their rights to sue. And so we organized and we said, you can't pay and you shouldn't pay, so declare yourself on strike. And the strike took off, and eventually hundreds and thousands of students from Corinthian went on strike, and then students from other for-profit colleges. And this is actually where the movement for full student debt cancellation started, with students who had gone to these for-profit colleges who are the poorest, who are going to very unregulated schools, often for vocational degrees. And it was thanks to their bravery and their organizing and some of the legal tools that campaign uncovered that we actually are where we're at today. So these are some of the people who went on strike. Their movement, as I said, sort of grew from, we grew the movement from for-profit college students to students more generally, because in the United States, it doesn't matter if you went to Harvard or the University of Massachusetts or the University of Phoenix or ITT Tech, these for-profit schools, on the back end, your federal student loans are all the same. So on a sort of, on the level of sort of material, technical debt contracts, right? Your loans are the same, even if you go to different schools. So we started growing the movement from for-profit colleges. This is a photo from a protest in 2022, where this is obviously Joe Biden, and we were saying, pick up the pen and cancel student debt, because we had, our research had shown that he had multiple tools. We like to say there was a Swiss Army knife of tools that the executive branch could use to cancel student debt. This was another protest we had, a Fund Education Not Genocide action, where we engaged in civil disobedience. And just quickly, this is, just to give a sense of who's involved in this movement, here's a quick video of some of our older debtors. One of the tools in the Swiss Army knife was actually a regulation that said debt for people, debt that the executive branch could cancel debt for people based on their age.
We are slaves to student debt. Between myself and my children, I owe $211,000 in student loan debt.
I borrowed $60,000 and now I'm $268,000 in debt.
I borrowed $70,000. Over 10 years, I paid $60,000, and I still owe $75,000 more than I borrowed.
The interest is so high and it's compounded daily, it's predatory.
If these loans don't go away, they're going to garnish my Social Security. So not only do I not have any retirement savings, I have less than what I was promised for every time I paid my Social Security out of my paycheck for the last 40 years.
I'm the very first person in my family that ever went to college. But I have the worst off right now than everybody in my family.
Taking out student loans was the worst mistake of my life.
Insurance policies just to pay student debt. Yeah, what the fuck is that?
Joe Biden can fix this, and he can fix it today. There's the provision 902.2, which allows the Department of Education to discharge debts based on the age of the debtor.
Biden, don't forget, cancel student debt.
Unless Biden does something about it, it's never going to stop.
Time is running out.
So that's just an example, again, not the cliche student debtors, right? It turns out that when you look at the data, older people, people over the age of 60 are the fastest demographic of student debtors. Why? Because people lose their jobs and then they're told to go back to college and get a degree, or else they're taking out loans for their family. And they mentioned a regulation in there, 92.2. We had to, go and do the research and figure out, hey, actually, these legal authorities exist. It's possible to free these folks. And while we have not by any means won everything we want, I think it's important to say that this organizing did deliver quite a lot. So it took 7 years, but 7 years after we launched the debt strike of Corinthian students in 2022, the Biden administration announced, basically caved to our demands. We had said we want full automatic cancellation for every Corinthian student, and that's what was announced, $6 billion in student loan relief for over 600,000 people. By the end of last year, the Biden administration actually canceled $190 billion of student debt. Now, we had, of course, pushed the administration to say that they were going to do wide-scale debt relief of $10,000 or $20,000 per person, which we wanted them to do much more than that. For various reasons, mainly a neoliberal commitment to bureaucracy and paperwork and discerning worthy debtors from unworthy debtors, they failed to actually deliver on that in time, and bought right-wing litigants time to tee up a bunch of lawsuits and find a favorable hearing with the Supreme Court. But I think it's important to acknowledge that the organizing, put something on the agenda, and something that, frankly, 10 years ago when we were starting this movement, we never could have imagined, right? I mean, I think if you went back in time and told me during the Occupy days that we would win $1 million of debt relief, I would have been shocked. And we did this by building solidarity. I wrote a book on solidarity, and one of the things I was fascinated by is the fact that the term, if you just look at its sort of Western origins, it actually comes from Roman law, and the origins of it meant a debt in common, obligatio in solidum. So it's interesting to me that the idea of solidarity has debt at its core. But the idea of solidarity, of course, is just that we have power in numbers, right? That we are stronger together than we are when we're alone. We always like to use this quote at the Debt Collective: if you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. If you owe the bank 100 million, that's the bank's problem. So how do you actually build solidarity? So I mentioned, we went on strike. We changed the narrative. We did the rolling jubilee and bought and erased debts for people. We did legal research, but there's something sort of more fundamental than that, and that's getting people to see their struggles in common. I mean, again, going back 10 years, there was no movement of student debtors. Student debtors didn't feel an innate solidarity with each other. And like I said, there were big differences between students who went to for-profit colleges, public colleges, and there still are. But we started to break that isolation doing something really basic, which is a debtors assembly, where we would just invite people into a space to tell the stories of their indebtedness and to see that their struggles were actually related. That, oh, well, you might be different than me, but we are all struggling to pay our student loans. I'm going to skip that and just jump into the backlash that we're in. This is a drawing of the Supreme Court striking down that big Biden relief program I mentioned. And I just think it's important to talk about the fact that we are now in a moment of real backlash, one made possible by the fact that our demands weren't met. The Biden administration was extremely reluctant to use its full power to help working class people. And now we're seeing an administration that is eager and emboldened about using power to hurt the 99%, to hurt not just the working class, but the human and more than human world. So there's chaos in the student loan system. The White House is allegedly preparing an order to abolish the Department of Education, which sort of, I think, just proves our point. If you can abolish the Department of Education with executive order, you can definitely abolish student debt. And this goes, but this is not, it's not wholly unprecedented. This goes back to a longer contempt for the idea of public education. And I really heard Leigh-Ann's points that universities are complicated institutions, problematic in lots of ways. But they're also despised by the right wing for a reason. So the history of student debt in this country really goes back to Ronald Reagan, who was governor of California in the 1960s. California was, of course, the crown jewel of public education in the United States. And he made it his mission to attack universities and to attack students. Why? Well, they were diversifying. This is where the question of race really comes in. In the 1960s, more and more Black students were enrolling and getting very politicized on some of the campuses. This was, there were campuses that were the birthplace of the Black Panther movement. Of course, students at the University of Berkeley were famously mobilizing for free speech and against the war in Vietnam and for civil rights. And he literally said that imposing tuition would, quote, get rid of undesirables. Those there to agitate and not to study might think twice before they pay tuition. They might think twice before they want to carry a picket sign. And student debt, so student debt from its genesis in the US was really conceived as a means of social control, of suppression of solidarity, suppression of protests. And Reagan's model has really, really caught on. And the only way to combat that, I think, is with a big, compelling vision of free public college that is free as in cost, but also free as in liberatory. The Debt Collective, we often talk about free reparative public college, so public college that is attuned to the long history of racism and discrimination in this country. But I think this, even in this moment of intense backlash, I mean, the right wing has a vision. They have a vision of total demolition of education as a public good. And the only way we can combat that, I think, with it is something that is equal and opposite, but one that's solidaristic, inclusive, and that makes it clear that college is actually a working class, a working class good, and something that will that will benefit people from all walks of life. So I'm going to end there because there's lots more to discuss.
Thank you so much, Astra. That was a wonderful presentation. And thank you to Leigh-Ann. We have now about half an hour for questions, discussion. And I think what came through really strongly in both of your presentations was how important it is to conceptualize debt in all of its multiplicity, working across these multiple spaces of workers' lives, student lives, debt that is associated with medical provision, but all of these different forms of debt, but also the different kinds of subjectivities and contexts that are involved in them. That each of these, that the way that debt functions is to produce isolation across these. There's a very strong ideological and practical way in which debt produces and reproduces isolation. And one of the most important moves is to recognize that that isolation must be broken if we're going to get anywhere. And so the strategies around how to do that, in Leigh-Ann, the idea of breaking the frame of the language and the conversation of austerity and fiscus, and the work to unite across student and worker precarity. Astra, this beautiful work that's happening to show the links not only across universities and across different kinds of universities, but between different kinds of debts, is really beautiful. And I love your book on solidarity and the work that you've been doing to really build that out as a key component in addressing the isolation of debt. So thank you both for that. I think you've given us a rich ground for the conversation. What's coming up in so I'm not sure if you want to say something about that, but what's also coming up in the questions is how debt and the suppression of protest, the constitution of debt and the suppression of protest seem to go together. That there's something about the criminalization of political dissent and the criminalization of students through the process of debt and non-payment that go together. And, it's interesting that the language of abolition seems to apply to both, right? Debt abolition and the abolition of police or of forms of securitization on campus and beyond that that often are linked. So I'm wondering if you could say something about this relationship between debt and the suppression of protest, and how we might think of the abolition of debt and police abolition, or the abolition of securitization, how we think those together. So that's a strong theme that's coming through some of the questions. Astra, do you want to begin? You're nodding.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to zoom out, because maybe Leigh-Ann could speak more to the student issue, there's definitely a correlation between indebtedness and a reluctance to protest. And in fact, there's been research that showed that high rates of indebtedness correspond to lower levels of strike activity among organized labor. So, and it makes sense, right? If you think, I've got a mortgage, let's say you've got a mortgage, and striking might put your income at risk, and therefore you can't pay your mortgage, and that will put your housing at risk. There's going to be these sort of trickle down effects. And those are things that the people who have engineered the system have actually named, right? That debt has this disciplinary function. So I think I think with student debt, though, it's gotten so egregious for some people that the attitude is, fuck it, I'm never going to be able to repay. And this has gotten, I mean, if you think back to our origin occupied Wall Street, we had a protest marking 1 T-Day, the day student debt surpassed $1 trillion. Well, we're racing towards 2 T-Day. And so there's a certain point where maybe you think it can work. You'll keep your head down, you'll do your job, pay your student loans off. That contract has been busted for lots of people. And I think that's part of why there was a kind of new militancy that the debt collective was able to tap into, say, I'm never going to be able to pay this off. This is such a debt trap. The terms are so onerous. This debt is so odious, to use language from sort of sovereign debt, the sovereign debt realm, that it can kind of become radicalizing. But certainly, so that's just speaking literally to debt's relation. I mean, but debt itself is a I think very punitive thing for a lot of people, and we see we see many folks who leave the carceral system deeply indebted, whether they owe restitution, whether they're paying indebted for probation, and so the way these systems are entwined, I think, is it's really deep. It could be its own topic of a talk, but I think that's why the language of abolition works so well in this context.
Yeah. Thanks, Astra. So debt itself has a punitive function. The debt itself produces, and there's some writing on this, right? The debt produces structurally a political quietude, because there's a degree of that debt creates a culpability that forces you to make more conservative decisions, because you have this pending looming specter of owing something to somebody. Right?
Yes, except then across history, though, there have been moments where it crosses a line and it becomes too much, and debtors revolt. And this happens in the ancient world. This happened during the Great Depression in the United States. It turns out there's a rich history of debtors revolts back in the colonial era too. So there's a tipping point there.
I would say student protests in the South African context, debt is the thing that is still mobilizing people to actually protest at universities at the moment. We had protests at the beginning of the year, as we have had year on year since for decades. But what's interesting is that the argument to individualize debt with students hold that individual debt in a different way, I think, to the US. We have much kind of stricter regulations, and that's why I was speaking about the role of the illegal mashonisa, because we have stricter regulations around credit in the South African context. But strangely, young people are able to get into a form of debt that isn't a loan per se, but it is a student account that you sit with. And what happens and what mobilizes people to action is that even academically deserving students who have passed through their first year cannot continue and complete their studies, because that debt gets used as an exclusionary measure. And so where the individual gets excluded through the debt mechanism, you find that there is some mobilization. The difficulty in the South African context is that students are not even close to talking about abolition or non-payment. The argument is around insisting that the university should allow debts to increase. And universities are in a difficult situation because their funding from the state is minimal or is being reduced. And that has a strong correlation to state level debt. So the individual debt of the student and the university as an institution getting less public funding is completely related. We, as South Africa, have IMF and World Bank loans, which has resulted in the cutting of public spending. And so where we see students potentially being able to organize with teachers and health workers is that there are so many cuts because of the big country level debts through the IMF and World Bank that people are now mobilizing both around the individual debt, but the state debt that is in fact curtailing and cutting public services. So there's the possibility of organizing here still in a way, but people are not yet thinking about abolition. People are much more thinking about, at least at the university, how do we disrupt this idea that if we can't pay, even if we pass, we cannot continue. And then that's where the criminalization and repression comes to say, actually, you are the problem. Even if you've academically able to continue, you are now disrupting everybody else who passed but also paid their fees. So it criminalizes and shames people in that way. So in the South African context, there's still student organizing around debt, but it's mostly to say, allow us to continue, kick the can down the road. We will try to pay it off, but the debt is not necessarily with banks and credit institutions. It's through universities themselves and student fees. Another, besides the possibility of linking with the kind of health workers and teachers, is the fact that land and housing and accommodation is also included in what students have to bear in terms of them needing to get to universities or get from rural areas or get from the periphery to the places where universities are. And then you have the high cost of accommodation because of the way that the city and housing loans are structured. And so you have an additional burden on student fees, which is recognized as a form of debt, but it's actually a way of people accessing the basics of being able to study, not only tuition, but also being able to get to the context of the institution to study and be accommodated. So I think debt still is a major mobilizing force here for resistance at both the individual and student level and at a broader societal level because of the structural adjustment and the cutting of state spending on public services.
Thanks. There's a very interesting question around how powerful shame is as a mechanism in the elaboration of debt and in the politics of debt. And I think you could also add fear to that, shame and fear. So maybe, Astra, if you could help us think about what are the strategies for organizing with shame and fear in the room? How do you, if you haven't reached the tipping point where it's actually impossible and you have a revolt and a debt rebellion, and the organizing is around trying to figure out how to collectivize, how do you strategically work against that kind of shame isolation in your practice?
Yeah. I mean, so many social movements have actually dealt with this, with the question of overcoming shame. I'm thinking about movements for gay liberation. I'm thinking about movements for disability justice, right? I mean, movements of groups where they've had to say, we're stigmatized, right? And we're not going to take it anymore, right? But there's some profound work that has to be done. So I think that there's a way that the United States shames people for being poor, specifically shames people for being in debt, but it's actually very much in line with a move other movements have had to make. As the anthropologist David Graeber liked to point out, the word debt actually in German means guilt, right? I mean, so at the level of language, debt is so guilt and blame ridden. And so there's, so it kind of takes that dynamic to the next level. So we at the Debt Collective do it in different ways. That's why I mentioned the debtors' assemblies. I think one is holding space where people can see their struggles as related to other people. For me, that first moment was at Occupy Wall Street. There was a guy standing there who called folks forward and just said, hey, step right up and write down on this piece of paper what you're worth to the 1%. And people just wrote their debts down. And for me, that was a huge moment where I had been so overwhelmed by my student loans at that moment. I had recently defaulted. I couldn't imagine anyone had it worse than me. And it turns out I was completely wrong. I didn't actually have a huge ambulance bill. I didn't have a big dental bill. I wasn't actually putting my rent on my credit card like so many other people who are part of that movement. So opening that space for people to listen or to speak, I think is a really key first step. And then to ask the question, well, who's to blame? Who should be ashamed actually? Well, it's the predatory lenders. It's the people who are gutting education. It's the people who don't, believe that curiosity should be subsidized by the state. They are the ones who should feel this shame. So I think that, having the analysis, having the ability to, understand and critique the larger economy is the next step. But I think at the Debt Collective, we often say, we're going to fight together for debt abolition, but there is that, if nothing else, we will help relieve you of that shame and help turn that shame into solidarity and power so we can so we can transform the system. We also, I just want to say, we also, there's I think language things that are important too. So we never use part of why we use the language of abolition is we reject the language of forgiveness, which is the standard language. And it was sort of very, very small victories, but we did notice how that was catching on over the last few years, that even on official websites, there would be talk of cancellation and relief and less emphasis on forgiveness. And our point was debtors did nothing wrong. You shouldn't feel that you didn't do anything wrong going to school or going to the doctor. Who needs to be forgiven? Not you.
I remember in one of the collective meetings in the middle of the Fees Must Fall protests, when workers were speaking about what it meant to have been outsourced and kind of shamed into non-belonging to the university, right? This kind of separate category of person at the university. Because they had been involved in student movements and the student movement was intensively reading Fanon, there's this line from Fanon, which is actually drawn from the Bible, where he speaks about putting the first last and the last first. And so it was this amazing moment in the middle of this meeting where a Black woman who was a member of the cleaning staff at the university, outsourced, stood up and said, "We are the last." And Fanon says, "We should be put first." And so this kind of flipping, the capacity to find a political language to flip the script of what's going on, I think is really crucial. Yeah. Leigh-Ann, did you want to say anything?
No, I was looking for questions.
Okay, I'll give you another one.
Out there.
Give you
Are they
another
out
one.
there?
They are. So one question came in about how the conservatives will often use the language that students are university educated people, they're part of the middle class, they're actually rich comparatively, why should the debt be cancelled? I think you've in part answered that, but I think it would be useful to hear a more kind of stringent critique of that position. It's very helpful. So do either of you have anything to say about that? Leigh-Ann, go ahead.
I mean, yeah, I mean, in the South African context, as I was mentioning, there is Black tax. And so a lot of Black university students, the majority of university students in number, are coming from working class and very poor environments. Access to university in the South African context means that you can access what's called NSFAS, which is the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. And so we don't have free education, but we have education that is subsidized for the poor. And so people actually get access to universities. And this is a form of supporting people's families. And we have our economy, we have a very high unemployment rate. And so students get put into a position. So just speaking about students as, they're on their way to the middle class, and they should therefore, behave as middle class subjects. Many students are actually in a context where they are taking some of the student financial aid, sending that back to support families and trying to study under conditions that are. So this idea that there's this middle class subject that is just taking from the institution and not willing to contribute and therefore needs to be punished, I would disagree with that really, really strongly. In the South African context, university students are not getting to the middle class. They're using the financial aid they have to fill the gaps of a failed economy and a really difficult economic situation at the moment.
I think when I'm responding to that argument, it always depends who I'm talking to. And you can make a kind of quasi-capitalist argument for debt cancellation. You can say there's so much student debt in this country, it is suppressing the ability of people to move and buy homes, to start businesses, to start their own families. And there was research by the economist Stephanie Culton and others showing that full student debt cancellation would have been an enormous economic boost, because here people are sending their monthly payments to the government instead of spending them in their communities. And so occasionally, we would resort to those arguments. Those aren't the ones that move me the most. I think the other thing I would say is, well, who really has student debt cancellation? Most people don't have their degrees. They actually have the weight of debt without the benefit of that degree. That's 40% of people. That's millions and millions of people. It's folks who are trying to just be able to be competitive based on their class, race, gender background. And again, the crisis of elder debtors, which is an astonishing problem, and many people are having their Social Security garnished. They're not able to live they're not able to have anything approaching a dignified old age. I also, so I think we have lots of arguments on that level, but what we really need to make is the bigger, small d democratic, transformative argument that these debts shouldn't exist. Nobody should have to go to debt to get an education. That education is a public good. That the state should indeed be in the business of subsidizing curiosity, and that it's more efficient, more affordable, more just to do that. So I think we want to show how the view of the sort of very narrow view of education as sort of career training that would get you a return on investment, thus your debt is justified. We need to abolish student debt and abolish that framework as well. And so I think there are lots of ways to combat the skepticism about student debt relief. But we should always try to frame our arguments in a way that gets to this, more compelling horizon of educational transformation. I'm someone who actually paid off my student debt. So one thing I like to say to people who are against it is just, especially if they don't have student debt, it's just, well, are you an asshole? Like, why do you want people to suffer just because you had to endure this broken system? And it's quite telling, I think, when you look at the polls, who is actually against student debt relief. Most working class people were for it. Even working class right-wingers who didn't have degrees were for it because they understand college is too expensive, right? That it feels out of reach. Tended to be college-educated conservatives, but it's quite popular with most people because they understand that something is deeply broken about the system. And I think we need to work to build more solidarity among what seems like surprising constituencies if we're going to actually build the mass movement and the real power to combat the right's sweeping attacks, not just on higher education, but on all public services.
Thanks. There's a question it's a couple of questions that go to this dilemma about how universities, well, firstly, that a lot of people with student debt are now wondering whether they should ever have gone for higher education in the first place, right? So is it worth going and getting a degree under these conditions, and how debt can actually push people against an argument for education, right? So what are the dynamics around access to education that debt is making? But also for Leigh-Ann, in the context of your critique of higher education, should there be the build out of a kind of trade-based or technical education? And how do we think about whether whether a university education should be the kind of horizon for people to aspire towards under conditions in which the debt burden is so high? So it's really about the value of a university education, how that's conceptualized, and what kinds of arguments we want to make about public education around other forms of education in this context. Leigh-Ann, would you like to start?
Yes, maybe just to say something about the question of kind of technical. We have universities of technology, and we have institutions called TVET colleges, technical and vocational education and training. This is all part of post-school education. And the government financial aid scheme that I mentioned, that was actually something that we won in that 2015 moment of Fees Must Fall uprisings. The budget for that loan formation through the state was 50 billion rand, or just over. So it's a huge amount that is invested in post-school education. But that scheme funded approximately 800,000 students. But a major significant portion of that, about 565, was given to people attending universities. and only the remainder to people going to technical and vocational colleges. So there's a key question about where does the technical and vocational sit in relation to university education, which is considered to be the higher education, and supposedly for a smaller number of people rather than the technical and vocational. And in fact, I think a lot of that shifted because of university students organizing and mobilizing. And we are seeing that more students are saying, actually, why are we only getting funding when we go to universities? There should be more investment, or we should be more geared towards saying that there are technical colleges that we can attend. So in a sense, we have a broader post-school system, but currently the financial aid is going mostly towards university students. And this does skew where people think the support can come for them to continue study, and what that would mean for future jobs. So it is an important point, and we do have a system in place, but it feels as if people are going to the place where they can get more financial support, even if it ends up being debt later on.
Astra, did you want to comment?
I mean, I just quickly, I mean, I think in the US, there's such a scrambled conversation about this, because often when we talk about the college student, or what we think of when we talk about colleges, you know, the image that is transmitted is often, you know, Harvard University, which serves a fragment, just a fraction of the number of students. If you compare the number of students who go to the Ivy League versus a large state school system, right? It's tiny. And it also completely obscures the fact that millions of students go to for-profit technical colleges, right? These are the students we started organizing with. And these schools are often the most expensive and reap the least career benefits. So, you know, in my ideal world, there would be, you know, this is such a broken system, right? I mean, people do need vocational and trade school training, right? There's lots of jobs where you need special training. But as I've worked with students who attended these schools, what comes out is they would love to be able to study literature and poetry too, right? Like, and they didn't have the background that made them feel entitled to get that kind of education. I think we need to really articulate a vision of public education as a working class good, something that everybody should have the right to, and to debunk some of the ways that discussions of so-called practical degrees are framed, especially by politicians, because what they ignore is that the vast majority who are seeking these practical vocational degrees are being defrauded by private sector profiteers who have managed to access federal funding and are destroying people's lives and could be easily regulated out of existence.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes left. So just a final comment from each of you, if you would like to wrap up. Astra, if you want me to throw you something, there's a question about just how did the massive debt problem happen in the US? So if you can give 30 seconds on just why there is such a debt crisis in the US, that would be helpful. Otherwise, a closing comment from you both.
Yeah, I mean, the rise of, you know, debt has been used to cover up the fact that there was more and more inequality. I mean, the rise of household indebtedness corresponds to the deregulation of the financial sector, to the decimation of, you know, the New Deal welfare state, and to the stagnation of wages, right? If the minimum wage in the United States is $7.25, I live in a state where that's the minimum wage. Of course, people have to borrow to get by. And then, as I said with Reagan, you know, an ideology that says, yeah, the state shouldn't invest in people's development, right? In our, not just our capacity as a nation to, I don't know, compete with Sputnik, right? Or to have, you know, a competitive workforce, but something deeper, which is the idea of people as whole beings and democratic citizens. And that is part of, you know, part of why the right wing is attacking education right now is because they are threatened by that humanistic aspect of a college education. If you read Project 2025, they explicitly say, you know, their project is one of de-wokifying, right? The nation, of doing a kind of soul craft by statecraft, right? They don't want colleges where people challenge their framework. They want to implement what they call a culture of blessedness. And for them, getting rid of public education, however flawed it is, is part of their mission. So
Thanks,
debt, and debt has really, and debt is the rise of student debt, I think, has done a lot to make ordinary people skeptical of higher ed. And that's part of the damage that it's done.
Yeah, you have a minute.
I would say that, as I was trying to point out, universities are dangerous institutions, but they're always contested. I think they do have a role to play, and students are often at the coalface of pushing us to more radical questions and radical actions. And so for me, education as a public good is something we must absolutely repopularize and fight towards, because it is the thing that's going to help us to keep asking questions, critiquing, and resisting the status quo, which is highly unequal in the South African context. And I think the rest of the world is becoming more and more unequal in the same kind of way. So we have a lot to talk about to each other, and let's build the international solidarity.
Well, just thank you both so much to you for your amazing work. And thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you to the Feinberg Family Lecture Series, the Department of History at UMass Amherst. I think what we come away from today is a real sense that in the context of growing fear, shame, and isolation, really, it's an old school political necessity. We have to come together, we have to collectivize, we have to find ways of talking across our context about the condition that we're in and mobilizing with each other to strategize of ways to change it. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And I hope you feel emboldened in that task by this evening's conversation.